The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin on March the 17th. He's accused of being responsible for the forced deportation of Ukrainian children. But in practical terms, what does that warrant really mean for Putin? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampsheir. The warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes is a serious sign of intent. Few sitting heads of state have ever been targeted by The Hague. Theoretically, he could now be detained if he sets foot in any of the 123 nations who recognise the court's authority, for example, at the G20 summit in India this September. But Russia is not a signatory to the ICC and has said that the move has absolutely no meaning, and the ICC has no way of enforcing its own warrants. So, will Putin ever be judged at The Hague? And why haven't other leaders been forced to face justice? So let's meet our guests. In the studio, I'm joined by Toby Cadman. He is an international criminal law specialist, co-head of Guernica 37 Chambers. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., we have Thomas Warrick. He's senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former deputy assistant secretary for counter-terrorism policy at the Department of Homeland Security. And in London, we have Chris Nineham, who is a vice chair of the Stop the War Coalition and author of The People versus Tony Blair. So, Toby, if I can start with you, if I may. This situation that we've got where the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, Russia is currently not a signatory to the ICC, so they'll just say, well, tough, you can't have him. So is this relevant in any way to anyone?
Thank you. Yes, it is. The fact that Russia is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court has no bearing because Ukraine has given jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court, and it is for conduct committed on the territory of Ukraine. So whether whether Russia wishes to cooperate is not relevant. They have already said that they will not cooperate. They've actually referred to the arrest warrant, I think, as toilet paper. So they've been fairly dismissive about the process. But of course, there are a number of countries in which Vladimir Putin may wish to travel to who are members of the International Criminal Court. And of course, there is an obligation to cooperate. So whether we believe that we will see Putin in the dock of The Hague anytime soon or not, it is certainly significant, and it certainly changes things quite significantly.
If we have a look ahead to later in this year, in the summer of this year, Vladimir Putin was scheduled to go to South Africa on a state visit. Now, there are all sorts of different reasons why that might not occur now. However, let us assume that it does occur and he pitches up in Pretoria or Johannesburg. Are the South Africans duty-bound to arrest him at that time, or do they just go, well, he's a sitting head of state, he's got diplomatic immunity?
Well, it's an interesting point. And actually, the domestic legislation in South Africa is one of the more forward-reaching, forward-thinking legislations available. So they have very strong legislation that legislates for the crimes that Putin is charged with. But you've also got to take into account that not so long ago, al-Bashir had travelled to South Africa, having been indicted by the ICC for genocide. They decided not to hand him over. And obviously that matter went all the way up to the Constitutional Court. And so they're going to be put into a very difficult position as to whether they give effect to the arrest warrant or not. And there's a debate amongst international legal scholars as to whether the cooperation agreements with the ICC trumps head of state immunity. So it is going to be a question that is going to have to be answered effectively by the courts in whichever country he goes to. And the BRICS summit is the first one, which is likely to attend in South Africa. And again, because of what happened previously, it's going to be very difficult for South Africa to refuse to cooperate. And it may well be that South Africa effectively requests Putin not to attend.
Tom, if I can cross this to you, are you in agreement that this is quite a significant move by the ICC?
Oh, yes, definitely. We've just done a study that has shown that in the modern era, since 1992, some 83% of heads of state or heads of military who have been sought by international justice ended up facing justice in some form in front of a tribunal. So many of them like Putin, but also like Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and other dictators who committed war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and may have thought, well, I'm safe, ended up ending their lives either incarcerated or being brought in front of an international tribunal. So while Toby is correct, the prospects of an immediate surrender of Putin may seem rather low over time. I think the odds very much favor Putin actually facing justice at some point in his future. The ICC arrest warrant has changed the arc of Vladimir Putin's life.
Chris, what do you think that this means for Vladimir Putin himself? Is this merely a prickle to his ego, or do you think that this is something that might seriously concern him?
Well, I mean, I don't think it, to be honest, is likely to massively concern Vladimir Putin, but I do agree that it changed the situation. But perhaps not in the ways that your two other guests exactly have outlined. I think there's two problems here. One is the kind of historical selectivity of the International Crimes Tribunal and the whole way that it has been used, and the fact that we're looking at a situation now, 20 years on from the Iraq War, where no one who was involved in organising the invasion and the subsequent occupation, which virtually everyone agrees was involved at some level war crimes, has been indicted or has been charged. And so that selectivity is going to have a big impact on the way that this particular decision against Vladimir Putin plays out around the world. And I suspect there's a big legitimacy problem here. The second thing is, I think that one impact will be to strengthen Vladimir Putin's narrative, which after all is one of the ways in which he maintains his position, where he basically argues that the whole of the West is against him, that one of the aims of the current massive NATO support for Ukraine is essentially regime change. I think it strengthens that narrative. But I also think that, personally, what I want to see in Ukraine is a move towards a diplomatic solution, is a move towards a negotiated peace. And I have to say that I think this move is likely to make that process more difficult rather than easier. So in that sense, as well, I think it's problematic.
Tom, if I can bring that back across to you, is this a problematic move by the ICC in reference to the fact that, well, Vladimir Putin, he's got much less to lose now, because if he comes out of office, he can look across to Serbia and what happened after the Yugoslav war and say, well, if I leave power, what's the point? I can see what happened to General Pinochet when he stepped down from power in Chile. The authorities weren't successful in their attempt to arrest him, but they had a very good try at it. It might be safe for me to just keep pushing on in Ukraine and try and cling on to power in Russia as long as I can.
Well, and actually, we know that Putin was deeply affected by the revolution in Libya that drove Muammar Gaddafi from power. That's not speculation. It's obvious I don't agree with Chris that this will end up delaying peace. I think what we're likely to see is exactly the opposite, that a peace treaty negotiated right now would simply embolden Putin to continue his war after he's had a chance to rearm and replenish his troops and his tanks, and he would be back at it again. Instead, what this does is it signals the will of the international community that somebody who has committed crimes on the scale that Putin's forces have committed in Russia is never going to be allowed back into the family of nations, and that the Russians are going to need to make a change, as, by the way, the Serbian people did, as the Libyan people did, as other countries have done when they remove an autocrat. and a dictator who has committed crimes on the scale that Putin has. At some point, things will change in Russia. This is inevitable. It's part of the arc of history. And I think we're likely to see a future Russian government doing what other governments have done and saying, for a whole variety of reasons, let's draw a curtain on the past. Putting Vladimir Putin on a one-way trip to The Hague is a good way to renovate the country and rebuild its moral fiber.
Well, it may be, but let me just bring up a clip here from Dimitri Medvedev, who's the current deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, who had this to say when the ICC made their announcement. I'm afraid, gentlemen, everyone is answerable to God and missiles. It's quite possible to imagine how a hypersonic Onyx fired from a Russian warship in the North Sea strikes the court building in The Hague. It can't be shot down, I'm afraid, and the court is just a pathetic international organization, not the people of a NATO country. So they won't start a war, they'll be scared, and no one will be sorry. The judges need to watch the skies closely. It's got to be said, I mean, as far as incendiary language goes, it doesn't get a lot more incendiary than that, does it? Let me pass.
No, I mean, that's certainly true enough. And I would point out to any Russian commander thinking of launching such a missile that would undoubtedly lead to an arrest warrant for several crimes being committed by firing such a missile. And the reality is that an attack on a NATO country, the Netherlands is a NATO country, would be seen as an attack by Russia against all NATO countries. And that would not unleash, or that would unleash consequences that I'm sure Russia does not want to see happen.
Right. I want to address the other point that was brought up by Chris, if I can please, Toby. Chris pointed out that the ICC has a legitimacy issue because if you look through the 52 people that they previously passed out indictments to, they are, generally speaking, from across Africa, from across smaller countries around the world, places where the West can throw its weight around and, if you like, extract somebody relatively easily. But if you are of a certain political persuasion, you might look at people like George W. Bush, or you might look at Tony Blair, or you might look at Emmanuel Macron. All of these people eventually, of course, have authority over forces that are underneath them that might have done something wrong. Is the ICC not in a difficult position that they haven't been brought before it?
I think the problem that you have is that international criminal justice is imperfect and it is selective. And there has been criticisms of the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. There have been criticisms of the ICC itself in its selective approach to justice. But I think the fact that we may have done it badly in the past is no reason to do it badly in the future. And I think a lot of criticism has been made of the attention that Ukraine has got where, for example, Syria and Yemen didn't get that same level of attention. I think what we have seen now is what can be done and what should be done to deal with a crisis such as this. And just to correct the comment, I actually don't think it is improbable that Putin will end up in The Hague. I think it is quite possible that he will end up in The Hague.
But presumably after he's stepped down from his position of authority in Russia?
Not necessarily. I don't think that he has to step down. And the fact that we haven't seen, as Chris has quite rightly stated, the 20th anniversary of Iraq is a stain on international justice. It is shameful that there has been little or no attention to crimes that were committed in Ukraine. Clearly, there were crimes committed. There have been investigations by the service prosecutor in this country. Of course, there is a level of jurisdiction that the ICC prosecutor has, and he can't turn away from that. But the fact that that's not being dealt with is not a reason to not deal with this situation now. And the fact that it's not being dealt with, of course, it will always impact on the legitimacy of a process, but it doesn't make the investigations and the arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin illegitimate. I think what we've got to focus on is, rather than constantly criticize for what has not happened in the past, is to make sure that we do it better in the future. And I think what we are seeing now with states coming together, as far as Ukraine is concerned, is encouraging, and we should not discourage that unity and that initiative.
Let me take it across to Tom. Tom, let me put it to you, Chris's comment that we had. I'm going to move Chris's comment on very slightly, put some words in his mouth if I can be so bold. The situation in Afghanistan. The ICC was very clearly interested in looking at abuses that may have taken place or may not have taken place in Afghanistan. When they started looking down that avenue, President Trump over in the United States, as he was then, basically threatened the court with sanctions if they pursued that path. Now that he's stepped out of power, the ICC is heading down that path. Again, the United States is not a signatory. So how do we square this circle?
Well, under international law, where states have sovereignty, it's a sovereign choice of a country whether to formally ratify the Rome Treaty, as many countries have, whether to authorize investigations on their territory, as Ukraine has in this case, and whether to cooperate with the court's investigations. There have been previous instances where the United States has chosen to cooperate, and there are other situations where it has not yet chosen to cooperate. So these are sovereign decisions under the international legal system that individual countries make. The point is, however, once they make those decisions, they need to abide by them. And this is a very fundamental bedrock principle of international law. And so to your point earlier, for a country like South Africa, if Vladimir Putin shows up in their country, Putin actually has to worry whether the country's authorities would arrest him and put him on a plane to The Hague. Equally, countries have the right to decide who can fly over their territory. So technically, even Putin overflying a member state of the ICC, the state has the authority to order the plane to land, and they can take custody of Putin and send him to The Hague. So this does have a practical effect on the calculation of the Kremlin when they decide where to send Vladimir Putin for international conferences. And equally, countries have a right to decide whether they want their national leaders photographed next to somebody who's a wanted war criminal.
Chris,
can I come in on
yes,
on
of course you can, Toby.
Just one point I wanted to make is it's not a question that the US has cooperated in some and not cooperated in others. And I appreciate that we're looking at a different time now under Biden as what we're looking at under Trump. But let us not forget the fact that sanctions were imposed on the prosecutor and anyone cooperating with the prosecutor in relation to an investigation in Afghanistan and Israel. And that the problem with that, and I appreciate we're looking at a very different US administration now, that emboldens other states to take a similar approach. And just today, we've seen that Armenia now wants to join the ICC, and Russia has stated that there will be severe consequences to Armenia taking this step. So, I think when a state like the US takes such a position, and it isn't just, we're not going to cooperate with you, it is actively opposing that process, and that's where it becomes problematic. But I am encouraged that there is a more mature approach by the current administration, and particularly with the ambassador, Bathen Shak, who's the war crimes ambassador, taking a very, very active approach on Ukraine. I hope that changes US policy towards the ICC for the better.
I need to bring Chris back in at this point. Chris, what do you make of all of this?
Well, first of all, just on Toby's points earlier, I don't think the problem here can be characterised as one in which the conduct of the ICC has been poor or inconsistent or just weakly administered. I think the problem is there's a pattern, and the pattern is that essentially the countries that have been brought before the ICC, or the regimes that have been brought before the ICC, have on the whole been so-called enemies of the West, or countries in the global South, actually countries that historically have had a colonial relationship with the Western powers. So I think the risk here is that it appears as if the ICC is being instrumentalized in a conflict between the NATO powers and Russia as part of the attempt to pursue, Western war aims. Now, that may not be the case, but nevertheless, that is undeniably the way it's going to look. And when Toby says, I agree with a lot of the points that Toby makes about the problems with the way the West is, the way the US administration has performed when it comes to the ICC. But when it says that, it's positive that world countries are coming together around the Ukraine issue, I don't think that is actually what is happening. That is not the reality on the ground. For most countries in the global south, they're very sceptical about the US's aims here. And actually, they're in general taking a kind of independent or neutral or even, in some cases, pro-Russian position. So I don't think it's true there's this consensus either behind the US, Britain, Western NATO war effort in Ukraine or behind a sense of support for the ICC. And just finally, really, is it true that there's a serious chance that Putin will end up in The Hague? I can't see the circumstances in which that can happen unless, one, there's been regime change in Russia. Okay, that's possible. But, if we're talking about a military instituted regime change, let's face it, that the stakes are extremely high. Two, that somehow he goes voluntarily. I just can't see with any circumstances in which that's possible. The only circumstances he's going to be taken to The Hague are under duress. That suggests to me, once again, that behind all of this, and I suspect suggests this to a lot of people, behind all this is the project of regime change in Russia. And, step back a minute and think about what if that is the central Western war aim, the kind of the scenarios that suggests are absolutely terrifying, really. And
well, let me pass that across, if I can, to Tom. Tom, if I'm assuming you would disagree with much of that.
Yes. Well, let me start with the point that the ICC is not an American court. This is one of the great ironies to hear this from someone who in my State Department years was involved in dealing with the ICC, both prior to its formation and afterwards. The African countries whose warlords were among the first people to be given arrest warrants by the ICC, every single one of those countries signed up to the ICC treaty consensually and frankly without regard to whatever the views of the then current administration in Washington. So it's not possible for the ICC to be pursuing a, quote, Western, close quote, agenda. It is pursuing the agenda that the signatories to the Rome Treaty all agreed should be binding international law on them. And so there's no Western agenda here. There's an agenda of international justice, to be sure, but it's one in which the countries involved have signed up to willingly and as an exercise of their own sovereignty. The court is an international institution. It is not in any way beholden to the United States or indeed to any other single country or bloc of countries. It's beholden to the states parties that have made the sovereign decision to ratify the Rome Treaty.
We have a slight problem there, though, in that, as you've said, it's an international court to which people sign up. Slightly more than 100 nations, just under 150 nations are signed up to it. But if we look at the nations that are not signed up to it, the United States, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, pretty soon the Philippines, we've got a fairly large, substantial proportion of the world's population who are just going, no thanks, not for me.
Well, and this has to do with the way the court exercises its authority. There were problems with the negotiation of the Rome Treaty. There were amendments that have been discussed and considered, some strengthening the authority of the court, others going in different directions. But this is a form of the international process of how these kinds of agreements are worked out. The court is not a perfect institution, to be sure, but I think in exercising its authority on what Russia did in Ukraine, it certainly speaks to the need to address some terrible, terrible atrocities, city blocks that have been leveled, young people who have been forcibly taken out of Ukraine. I have no doubt we will see further ICC charges in the months ahead because the crimes that have been committed there truly do have no moral defense among civilized nations.
Tom, Toby, Chris, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. I am afraid that is all that we have time for on today's programme. But remember, if you want to see more discussion and debate, check out our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.